Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We're featuring today Professor D'Maris Coffman. Damaris is a very good friend of mine over a number of years, and she's delivered a number of Gresham lectures as well, I believe 3 over the last 7 years or so. And we thought it'd be really exciting to have an exploration of what's on Damaris's mind here in CommunityZ Chest. As I think you'll all know, CommunityZ Chest is very much the idea that we ask a member of our community to just come and chat about what they're thinking about, what they're exploring, and some of the issues that they find particularly interesting today. So a kind of a current issues program. We wouldn't be able to host these things without the support of our sponsors. And our sponsors do let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And I think you'll find today that Damaris is a perfect fit. Damaris is both an economic historian, but also works on the built environment at UCL. And is also just a deep thinker whom I admire. So I'm looking forward to her thoughts today. The agenda is fairly straightforward. We're going to give a little bit of background, and rather than me introduce her, Damaris is going to talk a little bit about why she is where she is. We'll then move on to her in-tray, look at some of the more surprising or thought-provoking things. And Damaris wants to talk about trilemmas. Many of you may remember that Mundell and Fleming back in the 60s posited a trilemma about money and basically said that an economy couldn't have more than 2 of 3 things. So fixed exchange rates, free capital flows, or a sovereign monetary policy, but you could only have 2 of those. That debate, of course, has been a long-standing political economic debate over the last half century. But Damaris is going to highlight a couple more trilemmas that face us, particularly as we look ahead to the demands of trying to meet sustainable targets. So that's it. Damaris, over to you, really. Could you just give us a bit about your background? Because you've got a very rich and interesting background.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you, Michael. I really enjoy the opportunity to be here. And I guess we have known each other now for almost a decade, because we first met each other in the context of that Center for Financial History that I established in Cambridge in 2009. And I was, again, a fellow at Newnham College. And I was a fellow in history, but I was also working in economics. And I realized I was essentially falling betwixt and between, because what I did had too many economic terms for historians and was too historical for economists. So eventually I began to realize in 2013-14 that all of my intellectual interests were motivated by questions that were really more in the realm of economic geography and were questions about the built environment. So in 2014, I took a senior lectureship at University College London at the Bartlett. And for those of you who think of the Bartlett as the School of Architecture, that's really only about 40% of the Bartlett. The other 60% of the Bartlett does just about everything else: planning, development planning, infrastructure policy, climate change, and sustainable heritage, a whole range of topics that form the other really 60%. And the Bartlett at the moment actually has the distinction of being the top built environment faculty in the world. We kind of flip-flop with MIT and perhaps Delft in the Netherlands for that distinction. But anyway, it was a really nice opportunity for me to move to UCL. And then in 2018, I succeeded Michelle Badley, who had left for Australia, to the chair in economics and finance of the built environment, which is where I am now. And at the same time, I also have been the director, the head of department for the Bartlett School of Construction and Project Management, which focuses on mega projects, program management, portfolio management, and social infrastructure, and construction economics, infrastructure economics. We have an MSc in infrastructure investment and finance that is co-branded with the European Investment Bank. So we spend a lot of time thinking about infrastructure policy on a large scale. We have a number of partnerships with Chinese universities as well, and we have 900 students and about 70 members of staff. So it's actually a fairly large school, and I've been doing that since 2017, and it's exposed me to a whole lot of very interesting people who are thinking very seriously about how to deal with climate change globally. My own publications cross a number of fields, from infrastructure economics to financial history, economic history, climate change economics, and I've also had the privilege of being the managing editor of Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, which actually has turned 30 years old. It's the 30th anniversary this year. And if you look online, you'll see 30 papers in 30 years of structural change and economic dynamics. We have about 5 Nobel laureates who've contributed. Structural change and economic dynamics looks at intermediate levels of aggregation in the economy, so looks at the role of sectors and industries and looks at what drives economic change over longer periods of time. And I think particularly with COVID-19, where we're seeing a number of key industries and sectors being decimated, that this journal will have a role in thinking about what comes next, what kind of economic opportunities arise from the wreckage. So you might have a look at SCED if you're interested in that. And SCED also now has an impact factor of about 2.0, so it's moved into essentially the top quartile of economics journals and is getting a number of new submissions from a range of newer fields as well. So that's kind of a brief overview of me. But at any rate, I am really thrilled at the moment to be leading a school that is a center of excellence in infrastructure and climate change as we're dealing with really pressing issues in both of those areas.
It's isn't it? Because I mean, I first came across climate change in the 70s, and that was at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. You know, the comparable bit to the Bartlett. And of course, you mentioned Delft, and interestingly, my daughter is right there at Delft doing geomatics.
Okay.
Why do you think it's the case that the architecture schools have actually had this influence? Where I think most people would have thought it came out of some kind of ecology department, or it came out of some kind of geosciences, but actually, in many ways, it's been the urban planning, the design, the built environment that's been equally contributing to this debate for 40, 50 years.
Well, there's an enormous amount of research done in those environmental science and geology and departments about what is climate change and the science of it. But in terms of what humans can do to combat climate change, that is something that's firmly in the realm of planners and those who build buildings and infrastructure projects. And there are two elements of this. One is that the amount of embedded carbon in the built environment is enormous. Portland cement is one of the largest sources of embedded carbon globally. Beyond that, of course, to meaningfully combat climate change, decarbonization of energy and transport, that's very much in the realm of planning and infrastructure. And it's impossible to contemplate these things without talking to people who work in this area. So, that is I think why these schools have become a focus for that. Also, and most importantly, the built environment faculties are interdisciplinary spaces. My own school with 70 staff members has 17 different PhD backgrounds. So it's inherently an interdisciplinary space, and it tackles problems and challenges rather than being organized as the philosophy department or the English department or the geology department or the environmental science department. So it makes it easier to tackle these topical questions.
Very good. Well, D'Maris, let's move along then. So could you explain to the audience, what's top of your in tray?
Well, I think a few things. One is that obviously, like all of you, we've been living through the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think that there's a lovely graphic that has the coronavirus along with carbon as two big challenges for the Earth at the moment and for those who live on it. And I think it's certainly true that little tagline in the IPCC's 2018 report, that increasing investment in physical and social infrastructure is a key enabling condition to enhance the resilience and the adaptive capacities of societies, is true, certainly. And I think there's a broad consensus emerging that infrastructure investment is the best response to both COVID-19 and climate change. But how to do it is a much more fiendishly difficult problem. And the image of the market, the state, and financial capital is essentially an homage to Bill Janeway's Doing Capitalism, in which he argues that in the West we often see this as a competition between the state and the market for delimiting power. But in reality, the state, the market, and financial capitalists are orthogonal to each other. It's actually a three-player game. And in terms of mobilizing private investment to make meaningful infrastructure investment, and in terms of mobilizing private capital to fight climate change, it is that kind of three-player game, and it's really unhelpful to think of it simply as the state versus the market.
Yeah, Bill's obviously got a lot of keen insights, especially about, I think I'd love to have him here talking about how he views COVID, because he's traditionally said the markets really only advance through bubbles, and bubbles are created either by war or by finance, and both of which are the state and financial capital affecting the market. Yeah, very intriguing.
Well, I think he takes that really from Brodel, and Brodel does have some views on plagues, and I think that this would fit into that scheme. But
Well,
I think the key thing is really that we do need to start thinking now about what rebuilding from COVID will look like, and that although there are some parallels with this question of mobilizing resources to fight climate change, there are also some points of friction as well.
well, we opened with the Mundell-Fleming trilemma of fixed exchange rates, free capital flows, or sovereign monetary policy. But in discussion to warm up for this, you wanted to talk about a new trilemma that you think is emerging, and I thought maybe we could touch on that.
Okay, certainly. Does the slide advance? Yeah. Oh, well, okay. So the existing trilemma, which actually I think, Michael, you had proposed initially, but is certainly worth thinking about, is how we maintain levels of infrastructure investment while maintaining debt sustainability and also combating climate change. Because some of the types of infrastructure investment that might be most appropriate in response to COVID-19 are not necessarily those that are consistent with the greening of infrastructure. And at the same time, although we have epically low interest rates, the question of the debt sustainability story further down the line is one that we need to think about. But I think what you were referring to was this trilemma that I was alluding to between climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and climate change remediation. So I guess you could advance to that slide if you want. I can talk through that. Yeah. So I think the issue here and something that we really need to start taking seriously is that COVID-19 was a really nice dress rehearsal for fighting climate change, because what it showed us is that even in the second quarter of 2020, when we were all globally in very serious lockdown, it only took us back to carbon emissions levels around 2006. And that's because the global population in 2006 was 6.5 billion, and today it's 7.5 billion. So demand side behavioral modification to fight climate change is a blind alley. But the only way to do that is to keep the developing world very poor and to try to enforce limitations on consumption in the developed world, which simply have not been possible during the COVID-19 pandemic. That it's really interesting in the States and parts of continental Europe and even in the UK, there's a really high correlation between people who deny the reality of COVID-19 and people who deny the reality of climate change. And those are the people who are out on the streets saying, masks impinge on our liberties. We can't be forced to do any of this. So what that really tells us is that it's politically and institutionally impossible to fight climate change from below. The idea that this is going to come about as the result of behavioral modification is not realistic, and it's going to be a top-down solution to climate change, which means that states have essentially three tools at their disposal, and this is, of course, discussed in the IPCC framework. One is climate change mitigation, and that involves decarbonization of energy, transport, and food systems. Climate change adaptation, of course, means adapting to climate change by building new coastal defenses, moving cities, making infrastructure investments at a scale that will allow you to cope with the consequences of that. And that also includes, of course, with median temperature rises, modifications to housing stock that will permit people to live in areas that are much hotter than they are otherwise. And then there's also this third option of remediation, which is trying to remediate, repair the climate, either by, on the one hand, removing carbon dioxide through afforestation, reforestation, or forms of carbon capture and storage, or by trying to reduce global median temperatures through solar radiation management or space mirrors or some other solution that tries to lower global temperatures. And at a small scale, everybody agrees that these three things are, complementary. They complement, they supplement each other. You can pursue them simultaneously, but as you scale up, you can't pursue them simultaneously. If you take remediation seriously and you lower global temperature changes, then the need for adaptation, disappears. You can't pursue remediation and mitigation, simultaneously. You can for a while, that's great, but then once you get to a certain scale, those two become inconsistent. And then with mitigation and adaptation, if you tell Indonesia that they have to move Jakarta, that they have to relocate all of these people and have to spend enormous resources and a lot of cement building a modern city for them to live in, then they're not going to meet their climate change targets for mitigation. So, these three things are at odds with each other. And I think the real problem in Europe and in the UK to a degree is that climate change mitigation has been the only thing on the agenda because people are saying we have to meet this 1.5C or 2C target, and we can do that through mitigation alone. we're not going to talk about adaptation or remediation. But hopefully what COVID-19 has taught us is that that's unrealistic. We will not meet the 1.5C or 2C, or possibly even 3C targets with mitigation alone. We have to recognize that adaptation and remediation are part of the story, and that whereas they're consistent at small scale, as you scale up, they come into conflict with each other and become quite a profound trilemma that I think will require global governance solutions alongside national governance solutions.
So to paraphrase, what you're saying is this looks attractive locally to some people. Oh, I can do all of these and we can get ourselves through it. But at a global level, it really is a trilemma. You can only have two of the three.
Mm-hmm.
Just to push that a little a bit harder, again, Mundell Fleming would say you can have any of the two, but not the third. Do you have a favorite pair?
Well, I think that I think that although it's also a question of how you sync these up, right? Because there are time synchronization to it as well. But I think that we would be better off mitigating and remediating climate change than trying to adapt to it at scale.
Okay, good. Let me just slip back a bit to the slides there. Now, we had a couple of things about the politics of it. So this is the existing trilemma as we see it, that we've got this problem where people are coming in and saying, hey, there's a great green recovery, let's just go for it. Debt isn't an issue. Climate change is the most important thing. Let's pour all our money into infrastructure investment. But Europe has done quite a bit in that regard already, hasn't it? And you had this slide you wanted to chat to as well about lessons that we can learn.
Yeah. I think here what's interesting, because we have a very close relationship with the EIB, they do co-brand one of our MSc programs. And clearly with the Juncker plan, in many respects, it was a success. But one real criticism of it is the idea that a third of the loan book, the loans would have been written anyway, and a third of the loans probably shouldn't have been written at all. That only a third of them really fit within this countercyclical mandate and had meaningful effects on the problems of regional the regional problems in Europe and the issues associated with that. So the mandate of the EIB was meant to change with the winding up of the Juncker plan to become Europe's climate bank. That was Macron's big idea, and I think most people at the EIB were quite happy with that kind of transition. But because of COVID-19, the EIB has been kind of tasked with countercyclical mandate, with sector support, particularly of transport. And the question really is that kind of support going to be consistent with this turn towards Europe's climate bank? Because it hasn't been the case. The transport policy for decarbonization in Europe it was very much about attempting to shift towards electrification. But the idea that mounting a sector rescue to transport, including maritime transport and air freight in response to COVID-19, hasn't been very green at all. And there are some real questions about how you would go about doing that. And I think in the UK, one of the key lessons here is that the Johnson's government's very much committed to infrastructure as a response to COVID-19, that we're going to rebuild the UK and particularly reach out to the regions who supported the Tories in the last election. But at the same time, there's this notion that we're going to do this in a green way. And I don't necessarily think that the Cabinet Office thought this through in terms of the way in which you can pursue both things simultaneously. In fact, I think a lot of the infrastructure projects they're committed to have very high levels of committed carbon, embedded carbon in them, and are not necessarily the kind of projects that are going to produce small carbon footprints. So there is a lot to really work through around that. The other thing is that COVID-19 is going to pose really significant challenges for state aid restrictions across the EU. We've seen that in part during the Brexit talks, but I think that's a dress rehearsal for what's going to come. And one of the real challenges in the Eurozone is that the Eurozone has been around now for a couple of decades and has restructured the internal economic interdependencies across Europe, which means that having independent nations violating state aid restrictions by investments in local industries will have a dislocating effect across the Eurozone as a whole. And I think similar problems also are on the offing in the UK, because the SNP aside, there's some real questions about the role of Scotland in this recovery and what the meaningful, the question of whether there will be meaningful infrastructural policy in Scotland, or whether that's something that they're going to pursue from Holyrood. So, these are things that we do need to think through. I think there is a real risk of kind of greenwashing in this kind of green recovery that Johnson has been pushing. And I think that there are lessons to be learned from the Juncker plan about how we can avoid that. But obviously we're exiting the European Union, but we don't have to refuse to learn from their experiences, because I think there are some very important lessons to be learned from the European response to the great financial crisis, because I think there's every reason to think that we're sitting on a COVID-19 economic crisis that will be much more profound than the financial crisis of the 2007 2012 period.
Just on here, these opportunities, what were the lessons that you think we should have learned from the Juncker plan?
Well, again, it's a question of trying to pursue a number of agendas simultaneously, and how well do they succeed? I mean, that criticism that a third of the loans were loans that would have been written anyway, and that the guarantees were essentially just underpricing, and then the idea that there were a third of them that were actually very useful on the one hand for increasing transport integration within Europe, but on the other hand had the effect of bypassing many parts of rural Europe that now are part of the political pushback, and the reason why some right-wing politics has taken hold in places like France and Italy, that there have been trade-offs involved in that. But then the final third, which really are just pork barrel politics, that there's an opportunity for that to take off as well in the UK, particularly because, again, the Johnson government's committed to that level of pork barrel politics in the north in response to maintaining, to the mandate to maintain the blue wall. So I think that the idea that massive, large-scale public investment, unless you accept that this is all Keynesian waste, then there needs to be some thinking really about what kind of prudent financial management do you expect of a large-scale rollout. And I think with COVID-19, the really key investments initially need to be in social infrastructure, in the health and care sector. But these are not the big ribbon-cutting projects of transport and energy that the Johnson government wants to put its support behind.
We've got some questions flowing in, but just before we move, I'd just like to move just a little further along in the slide deck here. You wanted to say a few words about these two interesting books.
Well, I think that if you're interested in knowing a bit more about the way the Juncker plan is played out, and why, despite the Juncker plan, there still has been chronic underinvestment in infrastructure, economic infrastructure in Europe, a look at the European Public Investment Outlook might be worth it. This is published by Kranek. This is the inaugural issue. They plan to publish it every 2 years. Kranek is at Cattolica in Milan. It's available through Open Book Publishing, and I think it might be interesting. You can download it. We have a chapter in there with my team on the ecological transition. We presented this a couple of weeks ago to the Ministry of Economics and Finance in Italy. I've also presented it in Tokyo to one of the Chinese government Chinese planning ministries in terms of looking at this from the European perspective. Also, we have a book on the political economy of the Eurozone, which might be helpful in understanding what I was saying about the idea that the Eurozone has become its own unique polity, and that actually monetary integration has created economic interdependencies amongst the nations within the Eurozone, which make for real coordination problems at the level of national infrastructure and industrial policy. And that you can get from Cambridge University Press.
We'll make a particular point of putting both of those up on the web holding page here for everybody, so that when you come back for a recording, it's there. Now, you opened with this very, very important point that we've had COVID-19, and it's kind of a dress rehearsal on mitigation, adaptation, and remediation. I've got a few questions here. Maybe start with this one. Matthew Leach is asking, are there adaptations that do not compromise mitigation, at least not if you give them a few years to deliver savings?
Well, I think the real, it's interesting that, and this is a challenge for planners, the remediation of building stock is an area where there's probably a lot to be gained here, because in the UK, at the current level of retrofitting a building stock, it would take 2,000 years to refit all the residential building stock in the UK. Yet clearly, in terms of rising median temperatures and the fact that homes don't have air conditioning, and as summers are getting hotter, it's increasingly difficult for a lot of people to manage that green retrofitting of housing stock that does indeed adapt to higher median temperatures, but at the same time provides much more efficient energy use, is something that does pay real dividends, and is something that I think that there's a lot of scope for state support of that, because again, at the rate, the current rate is embarrassingly slow.
Wow, 2,000 years. I hadn't heard that before. Wow.
Brian Green, who runs a blog, Brickonomics, for the Chartered Institute of Building, has been making that point clear for quite some time. But yes, it's not 2 centuries; it's 20 centuries.
Matthew Leach has come back with, my home is cold and crumbling. I'm a bit worried about 2,000 years waiting for home improvement. Well done. I'd like to move on to another point here. Andrew Ross says, natural capital valuation is crucial to investment in sustainability. Can the insurance value of assets at risk be included in infrastructure investment decisions?
Well, I think there are a lot of firms that are thinking about how to do that, and I know that Meridian, for instance, is developing ratings that attempt to do that. But yes, of course, it is fiendishly difficult to decide how to value those assets. But it's a rich area for research, and both both insurance companies and asset managers on the other hand, buy-side asset managers are thinking about ways to do this, and so are multilaterals. So, the EBRD and the EIB have procured consultancy on how to develop those kinds of ratings. But yeah, I mean, that clearly is an enormous challenge, and it's difficult to get right. But I think that it's something that has to be attempted, and as many more entities attempt it, then we'll be able to compare the ratings and to try to develop metrics that arise from a discussion around different approaches. But I don't have a solution to that, or I would have rushed into publication with it.
Right. I've always called this geoengineering, but you feel free to correct my terminology. Graham Elliott is asking, leaving aside the public health problems that would ensue from the following, would an emergency remediation solution be to allow higher particulate pollution to create a shielding effect similar to the eruption of a volcano? You referred, of course, to other methods of deflecting sunlight, which I think fall under remediation, but you've also said you felt that the most important one was more likely to be negative emissions technologies. So some thoughts on that, please.
Well, I think that the last question about whether negative emissions technologies are now being deployed at a sectorial level at point source emissions for a variety of industries. So when I say particularly, especially negative emissions technologies, what I mean is that those are currently being used and will be scaled up. And then there'll be that question about whether standalone negative emissions technologies become feasible. But in terms of the question of geoengineering, and I think it's fine to call it that, what he's referring to is stratospheric aerosol injection. And I think that book that nearly won the Royal Society Prize, The Planet Remade, Oliver's book is certainly worth a look for those who are interested in it. But I think the problem with stratospheric aerosol injection is that this is one of those things where it's very easy to overshoot and will require global coordination so as to avoid doing that. It may be something that is scientifically possible, but politically very difficult to bring about. I mean, this is the Vesuvius or the Mount St. Helens or the nuclear winter solution. And I suppose, yes, one solution is to do it in such a way that gets a lot more particulate matter in the air. But then there's also the notion that, you could bring about a nuclear winter that would also combat climate change. It wouldn't be recommended, but it would be possible. So yes, that is technologically feasible. It's just a question really of how a governance model around that could be constructed. And I think that one of the real concerns about some colleagues of mine at UCL, Jacqueline McGlade in the IGP, and some people at STEEP, which is the kind of think tank within engineering that's a lot like the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex, their concern is that many state-owned oil companies, that their corporate venture capital arms have been heavily investing in solar radiation management, of which stratospheric aerosol injection, the type that you just alluded to, is the most promising candidate, because if they're able to develop that then they can argue that this shouldn't affect the fossil fuels industry. It should be possible to carry on doing that. And I think there's a lot of concern about whether or not that's desirable. And if we don't think it is, then who should really try to get ahead of that train in terms of thinking about solar radiation management? But sure, that is the kind of, I mean, literally, that is the nuclear option for fighting climate change.
Now, on this new trilemma, Angel Gaviero agrees with you that top-down is imperative, but how about the required alignment of global political leadership? Any path to achieve this, G2, G20, UN, etc.? I mean, we always need to come back to this idea that if everybody would sit around the table and agree on something. I have my own skepticisms about that. But what are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting, actually, that I mean, I have an American accent, and the U.S., the United States really are the bad boys of this at the moment because of the abrogation of international agreements and the apparent appetite on the part of the Trump administration, at least, to back away not only from the Paris Agreement, but also when he needs to energize his base, threatening to back away from the UN or, even NATO. I think that the U.S. is the real difficulty here, that the Chinese are largely on board. And in fact, with the announcement of carbon neutral by 2060, in some respects, are leading the way on this. They also are, from their own internal governance, in the position where it's easiest to enforce a top-down solution to climate change. Most Western democracies are not going to approach it the way that China is approaching it. But China is in a position where it can enforce ultra low emission standards, where it can force changing energy mix, changing industrial structure from the top, and can do so either through large-scale state subsidy or simply through insisting upon it and relocating people. China is also, and I think if you haven't looked recently, look at a map of China and you'll understand the problem that coastal China is the most heavily populated and the most vulnerable to rising sea levels. But then the Tibetan Plateau, is also very threatened by climate change because of the altitude and the aridity of it. So China is super motivated to do this, and they are leading the way at the moment. The question is whether or not the United States is ever willing to cooperate with China on this. And I think if there is a Biden administration, and that looks like the way the polls are going at the moment, what will the Biden administration do? Will they re-engage with the Paris agreements? And will they, I mean, there'll still be competition with China. They'll just be smarter about it. But there is a question really of whether there's also scope for collaboration.
Just a bit of light. You stuck this slide in about Busman's holidays, skiing and climate. What was
I mean, I love to ski. My family loves to ski. This is what we do as our main, recreational activity every year. We tend to spend about 4 weeks on the slopes when you tot up all the holidays. And I think it is really depressing at the moment to see to what extent the global ski industry is threatened by climate change. And, I have Zermatt in late March, early April, the idea that my mother skied this glacier in the late 50s, early 60s, and the scale of retreat of the glaciers in southern Europe, and then Lake Tahoe. This was in February, and there was a 6-centimeter base, which is scarcely worth traveling for. And the idea that climate ski resorts are places where people fly in from all over the world to ski, and the ski infrastructure itself is not carbon neutral by any stretch, although many resorts have committed to a low carbon footprint. And the extent to which this industry will perish within a decade if climate change remains on its current path. I love to ski, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about climate change while I am skiing. And that was the bit that Michael was asking for something funny. Yes, it kind of haunts my footsteps even as I'm enjoying myself.
Well, as a fellow skier, yeah, it is very depressing, and I happen to be a fan of Chamonix, and equally that enormous glacial retreat there. And you just look at these pictures, even recent pictures, and you see how rapidly it's happening. Anyway, talking about moving forward, now ski resorts are in many ways a transportation network, whizzing people around in chairlifts, not necessarily very environmentally friendly, and then whizzing around on skis. Melina Mara would like to talk about another transport network. She says there's a battle royale going on between the Mayor of London and the Johnson government on planning and transportation. look at Robert Jenrick's rejection of the London plan and refusal to bail out TfL, Transport for London. What would Professor Coffman advise both sides in terms of meeting net zero London targets? So there's a real adaptation, mitigation, remediation issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what we advise both sides is first to take a deep breath, because it is clear that these issues pre-existed the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the current financial crisis for TfL has clearly been magnified hugely and in the immediate sense precipitated by it. But I think that there's no question that TfL has to be part of the solution to transport problems in the capital and also to green transport in the capital. And it's interesting actually that, and we find this even at the Bartlett when we're doing various kinds of transport policy modeling. What's really handy about TfL is that they have everything. They have the data on trains, they have the data on the tube, they have the data on buses, they have the data on bike sharing. They are a fairly full service entity for this. And I think that the Johnson government eventually will have to cave. I don't see that there's any solution to that. I could see why they tactically are not doing so, but I think bailing out TfL at this stage is the only responsible way forward. I think what will eventually have to happen is that prime central London will need to be virtually pedestrianized, which will, and how you do that with the transport, with the taxis and the additional constraints that will impose, is not clear, and the role of the minicabs, Uber, and others for zones 3 through 7 also takes a lot of thinking. But I think that ultimately we have to accept that we need to pedestrianize prime central London, and even large parts of Zone 1 outside prime central London, and that we do need to subsidize. The problem with the transport with the tube is that London in 2012 for the first time exceeded its population in the late 1930s. After the war, London's population had fallen to approximately a third of what it was at the peak. And then population increased very rapidly in the 90s and early 2000s. And in 2012, had been back above that 1930s peak. And in that kind of environment, TfL's ridership was rising literally daily. And post COVID-19, there's not going to be that kind of commuting traffic. But on the other hand, any vision for reconstructing London post COVID-19 is going to have to rely on the tube network, because we can't go back to a model that you had in the 1980s where people could drive up to the Savoy and have a valet park their car and have lunch. It is going to London is, if the city of London doesn't return to the offices on the scale of the pre-COVID pandemic, then tourism will become even more important, and TfL is critical to that. And it's critical to that on the buses, the tubes, and the rest of the network. And I think that it really will require a lot less brinksmanship and a lot more horizon scanning of what role TfL can play in London's economic recovery.
Very, very, very interesting. Just on this trilemma sort of breaking, it's almost like a cascade, isn't it? Where I can look at mitigation, adaptation, remediation, and locally I'll just do my bit on mitigation, perhaps. It's not really a trilemma. Do you see TfL as at that level where it moves into being a genuine trilemma?
Well, yeah, I think
is it above that?
Not this year, but certainly within the next decade it does. And I think that there are the real questions about whether the planned expansions of the network are even necessary or desirable at the moment, and what those would necessarily mean. I think that it will take some time really to, clearly Crossrail will be completed, but then the extent to which the ridership will support the projections that enabled the investment in Crossrail, and whether that investment will be recouped within a reasonable period of time, is all now very doubtful. So this network is going to have to be repurposed, but I think it's in a sense almost it's not too early to shape, but it's too early to say what the new spatial dynamics will be, because it's unclear as yet, until we have a vaccine and until the COVID-19 pandemic can be declared over in some sense, and firms can take a decision about whether to bring people back in the office. We won't know whether or not they will, but it seems doubtful that people return to the office on the scale at which they left it in March. And the ramifications then for what will happen to central London, will it become increasingly dependent on tourism? Will there be other ways of mobilizing these assets, to generate revenues? Remains to be seen. And it is certainly, I think we're not in a position where we're going to decommission large parts of the network, but I don't think that some of the planned extensions beyond Crossrail are likely to come on stream anytime soon. And the other thing that's becoming increasingly apparent, which is what slowed down the remediation of the Victorian water mains, just how challenging the hydrology is under large parts of London. And to some extent, it's a miracle that these transport extensions of the early 21st century went as well as they did. So again, the suggestion to take a deep breath and to see what the return to work really looks like, and to see how TfL can support that return to work, but can also support other viable models for what a recovery in central London will look like.
Yeah, it's interesting. A very relevant comment just popped in here from Matthew. COVID has taught more people that they don't want to travel for 1.5 hours each way to central London just to do work in an office that they can do almost anywhere. Can we work more locally, but not actually at home? So that type of network change could be there.
I mean, one of my colleagues, Yolanda Barnes, who was head of world research at Savills before joining the Bartlett, spends a lot of time thinking about whether or not satellite offices are coming back. Whether everyone's going to live in Guildford or Folkestone and go to the office nearby, possibly. But I think that is going to be a really tough sell. I think to a lot of firms that. And also, of course, WeWork has been a casualty to some extent of COVID-19, but there's also a potential model that emerges from this pandemic that allows fractional use of offices for certain things, but doesn't assume that people are coming to these satellite offices every day and are not certainly coming to designated space for them in the satellite office every day.
Well, we've got time, I'm afraid, just one more question, if I might, and this is from Robert Woodthorpe Brown. Robert's asking, do you feel a robust calculation of environmental return on investment could deliver comparability between projects to highlight performance against IPCC carbon budgets, embedded carbon? And this aligned to socioeconomic return on investment. Would it deliver better economics and balance across this new trilemma?
I think so. I think one of the things that is going to have to be revisited very quickly are the damage functions within the IPCC integrated assessment models, because I think it's very clear that the damage from increasing median temperature rises is not linear, and that it affects many more sectors of the economy than those models initially proposed. And once that is significantly rethought and the damage functions are more realistic and take into account the thresholds, then I think those kinds of cases will be much easier to make, because the returns on investment will be much, much larger.
Very good. Well, D'Maris, I'm going to close in a few minutes. When we started, we both thought 45 minutes would pass easily, and it most certainly did, and in a delightful way, but also in a thought-provoking way. Would you like to just maybe make a kind of a final conclusion on your view about the outlook on this trilemma and what you would like all of us to do?
Well, I think that the main thing is that we just all need to be a lot more realistic about the likelihood of meeting any of the lower climate targets, the 1.5C or the 2C. And once we are more realistic about that, then I think it is possible to think about other strategies, including adaptation and remediation. But I think that the assumption that we all had, which is that behavioral change would be a way into a significant part of this, is just something that we can no longer believe. And yeah, I think COVID-19 has shattered a lot of illusions, but it also needs to shatter that one in people's minds. And I think that it is very clear that however disruptive this has been, whatever the enormous short-term economic shocks, there are also huge opportunities for those in investment management and financial services post-COVID-19, and that going into it with a re-enlivened realism makes it easier to seize those opportunities and to think seriously about what comes next. So I would just, advocate that people drop the wool from their eyes about the likelihood of meeting those targets. And I think there, the U.S. is a strange note to end on, because the reality is the U.S. has given up on climate change. That NASA has said it's going to be a 4.5C, median temperature rise, and that there's no meaningful way to avert that, so let's not worry about it. And that's also not widely enough known, that's one of the reasons the US has backed away from its own engagement with this. So I think bringing more realism to the table is what we all need to do. And when we do that, then it becomes possible to think about these other approaches and also how well or not they play together.
That was a lovely way to conclude. I don't think anybody would claim that you are an unrealistic academic by any standards. Delightful to have that. And I completely agree with you. The great outcome from this is, yeah, behavior change can make a difference, but not a sufficient difference to do it. We've got to get more serious. So thank you so much for sharing that message. If you could just hold on a moment, I've got 3 rounds of thanks to do. My first round of thanks is, as ever, to our sponsors. I hope that many of you I know are involved in the climate change debate. Many of you are involved in funding infrastructure, and I hope that all of you found today of use and a credit to your support. Secondly, I would like to say thank you to the audience. We have a variety of webinars coming up. As ever, just check them out on the website, and you can have a look at a whole raft of things coming up ahead. And I'll put a little tip in. We have a night at the movies on the 18th of November when we're going to be watching together Life is Beautiful, about Mandela's unsung heroes and the Rivonia trial in South Africa many years ago. But finally, I would just like to say thank you very much to D'Maris. Thank you so much for being a friend and coming on and sharing your intre and your thoughts and your concerns. And I really liked the point about COVID-19 highlighting and increasing our need for realism. And secondly, the focus on this trilemma that looks so easy, but at scale does pose some very difficult decisions. 2 out of 3. Let's hope 2 out of 3 isn't bad. So
thank you, Michael. Thank you for being such a brilliant host, and also to the audience.
I can't open up and show you the audience clapping wildly with applause, but I have here my Korean karmic clapper from the Buddhist temple of Bulgoksa, and I will thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
I hope to have you back again and hear more about what the Bartlett School is working on as well. Thank you,
Likewise. Thank you, Michael. Take care. Bye-bye.